Mr. Reeder, were you aware of an allegation of inappropriate and unwanted sexual discussion at an EPA happy hour on December the 4th, 2013 at a restaurant? Were you aware of that? You know why you weren't aware of that?
I'm sorry. No, sir.
You know why you weren't aware of that, Mr. Reeder?
I don't know why.
Because you didn't bother to ask Mr. Jutro's supervisor when you during his background check. He knew about it, but you didn't bother to ask him. How about on July 29th, the same female was again the victim of inappropriate and unwanted sexual discussion by Mr. Jutro at the White House Innovation for Disaster Response and Recovery Day. Do you know about that?
I do not know.
You know why you didn't know about that, Mr. Reeder?
No, sir.
Because you didn't bother to ask the person who did know, which was the immediate supervisor of Mr. Jutro, while you were vetting him for another position. Did you know about an inappropriate and unwanted hugging and kissing that began with one of the victims in 2007?
No, sir.
You know why you didn't know about that, Mr. Reeder?
It wasn't told to me.
Because you didn't bother to, no. You weren't told, you didn't ask. You didn't interview his immediate supervisor. And do you recall what your rationale was for not interviewing that immediate supervisor?
Yes, sir.
What was that?
At some point before Dr. Jutro was put into the position,
I'm looking for an answer. I'm not looking for an encyclopedia. What reason did you give for not interviewing the immediate supervisor of the person that we're describing?
Congressman.
You want me to refresh your recollection, Mr. Reeder?
I think if the
Because you don't talk to people at that level. That was your response.
That's the characterization of somebody else, sir. That's not my characterization.
It's the characterization of the Inspector General, Mr. Reeder.
So if you would like, I can explain.
Well, no, I'm going to get through first, Mr. Reeder.
Yes, sir.
Were you aware of an allegation of inappropriate and unwanted hugging and kissing that occurred at another White House meeting in approximately 2009, 2010?
No, sir.
Do you know why you weren't aware of that, Mr. Reeder?
No, sir.
Because you didn't bother to ask the person that had knowledge, which would have been the immediate supervisor of the person you were vetting for another office. Were you aware of inappropriate and unwanted hugging and kissing and sexual discussion that began with yet another victim in 2002?
No, sir.
You know why you weren't aware of that, Mr. Reeder?
Congressman.
Because you didn't bother to ask the person who knew. Did you volunteer the information when you were asked?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what information you're referring to.
Did you know any of these allegations, Mr. Reeder?
No, sir.
Why did you not interview, well, let me ask the Inspector General. Do you agree with that, Mr. Inspector General, that Mr. Reeder was not aware of any allegations of wrongdoing at the time that you interviewed him and failed to volunteer it?
Let me defer to Mr. Sullivan, who has the facts on the investigative piece.
Mr. Gowdy, we determined that at a minimum, Mr. Reeder was aware of the offensive discussion that Mr. Jutro had with Ms. Felt, and he was also aware of the reporting of Mr. Jutro's sexual harassment, including unwanted hugging and kissing with a senior executive, and Ms. Felt reported that to Mr. Reeder, as well as other senior people, including the former Deputy Administrator, Mr. Perciasepi, before Mr. Jutro was appointed as the Acting Associate Administrator.
And what did Mr. Reeder do with that information?
I don't know what he did, but we didn't find out about it.
But he was on notice before the promotion was made of some of these allegations.
Yes, that is.
And would have been on notice of
Correct.
more had he bothered to ask the immediate supervisor.
Well, had he asked the immediate supervisor, we had interviewed the immediate supervisor. That supervisor told us I would have absolutely shared that with Mr. Reeder, but he was never contacted.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.